cards.
Okay, that sounds fine.
Hang on.
Yep, it's just streaming.
This is live.
All right. We are live.
Just waiting on that 6 o'clock.
Yeah. Well, we can go ahead and get our game face on because I think we are ready to rock and roll on Facebook. It is the 4th in our series of Money Matters issues, Money Matters series on FAFSA 101. So let's see if we can get started here. All right, yes, I say let's go. So hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us again this evening. We are live with the 4th in our series of Money Matters series on Money Matters. Oh goodness, sorry, I'm sorry. I'm just all kinds of
Technology's happening.
technology is happening again. Yeah, and I can't see what's going on.
Oh no.
Oh no, did I lose Jade? Oh no,
We still have a couple minutes to 6 o'clock, so let's make sure everything's jamming.
Yeah, I think I did lose her. Okay. Well, hopefully Jade will come back in. I don't know if that was me that lost her, but we are live. We are missing our good friend Chris today, but he has some other errands to run today, so he was not able to be with us. But we have some new folk with us today. So we have Dee Dee and Lauren. So Dee Dee and Lauren, with you, would just introduce yourselves and tell everybody who you are, what you do.
Sure. So I'm Lauren Pacheco. I'm a verification counselor at UNC Greensboro. You've seen me talk with Chris, who is also in verification before, and we're happy to have Dee Dee joining us today.
Hi, and I'm Dee Dee Carter. I'm one of the financial aid counselors here on our staff and been working here for quite some time. So I'm excited to be here with you guys tonight.
Excellent. So tonight we're covering as I said before, the 4th in our series of FAFSA 101 Money Matters issues. We are looking at tonight FAFSA eras. And here's some things that as financial aid administrators, we have come across, and we've determined that these are some of the things that people typically get tripped up on when they're doing the FAFSA, when they're going through the process. And sometimes these things can be, fixable right in the moment. Sometimes they can throw things off and delay the processing of the FAFSA. So we just wanted to highlight these things for you so that you know what to expect, give you an opportunity to ask questions about these, and let you know that, again, if you have questions or there are things that seem more difficult for you, we are here to help you. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Lauren and Dee Dee, and they're going to walk you through this. And I am going to check out our feed, make sure everything's going well on the tech end. So take it away, Lauren.
Awesome. Thanks, Deborah. Okay, so as Deborah was saying, again, this is something that in the financial aid office, we all want to make sure our students and families know that we're looking out for these, but we're only half of the equation. So any time that we can talk about preventing errors or, common things that we see that pop up that we can squash before they come in, through on an application is our goal. So we want to make sure that we talk about these things. So just, a quick reminder that most of these errors that are common are quick to fix. We can help you fix them, or you can return to your FAFSA and make a correction. So that is something, again, a lot of the time it can be daunting or confusing. And we want our families and students to know that most of these errors are fixable, and we just need to find a course of action for them. Mistakes on your FAFSA can affect your financial aid. So if a number gets typed in incorrectly, or if you answer something that doesn't really apply to you, it could affect your aid either positively or negatively, but we want an accurate picture of what your eligibility is. So it's really important to not have those mistakes coming through, because we want you to get all the aid that you're eligible for. So we're going to talk about some of those tips for navigating the FAFSA, just, as we are looking for these common errors and trip ups that you might, be on the lookout for. And as always, we always, are like on the bandwagon with getting students to contact us. So when in doubt, reach out. Don't be afraid to give us a call. All of our contact information is going to be on one of our slides, which is accessible to you guys later too. So just know that we are here for this purpose. We want to talk to students, and part of our FAFSA 101 Money Matters series is making sure that we're reaching out, and that contacting us is something that we want you to do. We don't want people to have errors, or be afraid to reach out to us. So just to kick it off, these are not generally numbered throughout the whole presentation, but I would say counselors, everybody in financial aid can agree that filing your FAFSA late is a big error, probably the number one error that we can see, because we have the date that you filed your FAFSA when we get it, and we can see when you did it, and it can affect how much aid you receive. So we are always going to stress filing your FAFSA early. Every year it opens October 1st. So this past October 1, it's already open for the next school year, which is the 2021-2022 academic year. And they even have a period for early filing called priority filing, which lasts from that October 1st date to January 15th at UNCG. So it's actually going to be, early or late. I know that sounds so harsh to put it that way, but don't be a late filer, be early, be priority. Dee Dee, did you want to speak on that a little bit too? As a counselor, I know that you see them coming in too. We still see the majority of people filing early, I would say, though, right?
We do have a lot of students who file early. And I think for this year, we all know that things have been in flux. So pushing back that priority filing date to January 1st, or January 15th, January 15th, will give people an opportunity, if you are still working on your 2019 taxes, to get those taken care of, if there are, updates or extensions you filed. So I think that will really help families. And one of the big things too about filing early is that if you do make a mistake, it gives you more time to get that mistake resolved, because you would hate to put on your FAFSA, especially for new students, as you're making your decision about where to go to college, that you've put on your FAFSA something incorrect. All of a sudden in July, we get the correct information, and now you're not eligible for something.
Right.
That's always a possibility, and we would hate for you to have missed out on an opportunity because you had an error thinking that you qualified for more aid. So definitely getting it in early allows us a chance to go back in and fix any kind of mistake. Even now, I'm getting students calling in who, good job, we're there the first day, but then realize that they maybe put something on there incorrectly. Well, they still have time to go in and make that correction now, as opposed to day one of classes.
Right, that's such an important point, because like you said, their qualification for aid can change, but it's because we're awarding that aid all through this point, in time. So it's not, well, you had it, now you can't. It's, you had it, now there's a combination of, well, maybe you're not eligible for that, but is some alternative funding that you might have been eligible for now gone? So the timing on fixing the errors, like you said, is super important, but it's tied to that availability of money too. So that's really a good, way to phrase it, like everything, especially talking about FAFSA errors, we want to catch as soon as we can.
Right.
Yeah, thank you.
No. And I think one of the things about the priority filing date, which is now January 15th,
Yeah.
it's not a deadline, but I like to use the analogy of anytime you hear, there's like free cookies somewhere or taco truck, you want to be as close to the front of the line as you can be. because even though you got in line, if it goes too long and there are too many people in front of you, they may run out. And so you might have gotten something amazing, but it ran out. So that's another great benefit of filing early, is that you're kind of at the front of the line. So that way, you know, when you get your plate of tacos, everything that is on there is what you qualify for and, you know, kind of what you wanted, as opposed to being like, man, you could have had that, but unfortunately we gave it away before. So that's another real big push to make sure you're filing within that priority filing window. So.
Oh my gosh, now I'm really hungry.
I'm sorry, I know it's late.
Yeah, Dee Dee would go to the food analogy, but then you also have a plate of cookies there and some hot chocolate with marshmallows. So you started us down this hunger path.
I'm sorry.
I didn't want it to be spooky season without a FAFSA conversation, and it's not spooky, and you can do it from the comfort of your home.
Slogan. Yeah, Dee Dee had a good slogan last year. You know, to follow FAFSA, it's not spooky. Right?
It's not.
Yeah. So get it done.
Right, man. But now I'm just looking at a picture. You're right, though.
Oh, it does look good. Okay. So what else? What's we know that filing late definitely is the number one, or maybe number two, because not filing is probably the number one, but filing late is definitely the number one. So what else after? So you've got it filed. Now what? What other things happen as you go through the filing process?
Well, just and we'll talk to some of those other points in, you know, our conversation later too. But just because you brought that up as well, when we're talking about doing it early and what happens next, like keeping up with the steps as you go and not like filing it away and forgetting it is super important. So it's somewhat of a process every year. You want to make sure you're checking right away. Did I get an email confirmation that it was submitted? Because if you didn't, maybe your early submission didn't even go through. So they send you an email right away that you submitted an application. And by they, I mean Federal Student Aid, Department of Ed. So they will send you an email right away when you file your FAFSA with the government. And a few business days later, they'll send you another email that confirms they processed the application as well. Because this application is not unique to the school. It's the federal application. You can put up to 10 schools on it. So they're managing the application and then it gets sent to schools later. So keeping up with the timeline and making sure you're getting those confirmations is super important. UNCG probably won't bring in and start working with FAFSAs until later in November. And then hearing about your financial aid package might not happen until like early in spring, around March. So knowing the timeline, but also knowing that you're following those steps along the way is super important. And it's not just clicking submit and forgetting about it.
Right. Yeah, it can be kind of tricky because if you file in October, you know, maybe you're a new student, you haven't even applied to your school yet. Or, you know, maybe you're a current student, you're like, man, we're still in the fall semester. So it can be really one of those things where you're like, oh, I did the FAFSA check, I'm done, not realizing that maybe later on there's some other steps that you need to take. So definitely, you know, we don't necessarily want you to submit it and then call the school right away because, you know, we haven't started that process yet, but definitely when you submit it in October, make sure you're checking back in and, you know, January, February to see what's going on. You're checking your email, things like that.
And making a habit of doing it in October too, because as a continuing student, say you trip up and you're a late filer and you do it, like I'm starting school this fall and I'm a sophomore, I just remembered my FAFSA that I had to do it. And oh my gosh, my bill's coming up. So it's August and you file a FAFSA, you get your bill figured out for fall and you're in school and you're like, great, that was really stressful. But then October 1 rolls around and you forget, like, no, like this is the next year's FAFSA. So creating that habit of doing it early every time can help keep that timeline and make sure throughout your years in college, you're consistently doing it at that right time as well. Because that summer where you take care of it and you feel that it's good and your sense of accomplishment is there and you're riding the wave of like, my bill's paid, you'll be in classes in fall and it's really time to do the FAFSA again. So doing it in October early helps to set that every time a nice, you know, less stressful way to approach it by doing it early. Yeah, those are all the things I would say tied to doing it early, keeping aware of the time is important.
Lauren, I was going to say that really feeds into our next slide of just making sure that you're saving your information.
Yes.
Because again, maybe you do the FAFSA in October and then it's a year and a half later almost, or it's like many months later. And now all of a sudden you have to go back in and you restarting it. You're like, well, okay, what was my password? What was my mom's password, my dad's password? You're trying to navigate all of that. Even, I as a counselor actually have a FSA ID because it's easy for me when students call in, they have questions to be able to log in. And I have it written down because honest to goodness, if I am not using it constantly, I have forgotten what it is. And even as much as I try to make it something that's easy to remember, I'm still going to forget that after several months. I kind of have it saved away in one of my little notes on the phone, what my password is, those security questions. And especially, parents, as you're navigating with multiple kids, you're going to have different FAFSA IDs, different schools have different login kind of phrases. So it's really important to make sure you're saving your login information somewhere where you can find it and not just hoping that your password manager on your phone or computer is going to save it for you.
It's an excellent point. And, we, just like you said, as a counselor, how you're keeping this info for yourself to make it easier and remembering, because they do switch up how, like, you can do the FAFSA on a mobile app now, you can do it on a desktop. So the look might change a little bit, but I took a screenshot anyway, just of the desktop version, because the FSA ID page is managed by the federal student aid, folks. They also have their separate FAFSA page. They're all linked somewhat together, but you'll see it has a forgot username option there, forgot password. So we want to encourage everybody to save it because it saves time. Hitting an extra hurdle is not something you want to encounter when you're just trying to get into the application that you're already organized with your family to do at a certain time and that kind of thing. So there are backups and that's good. But definitely, as a counselor, we've sat with students at the front desk. Oftentimes we'll have a whole appointment set with families to come do the FAFSA and we won't be able to complete the appointment because they won't have their IDs from the previous year written down or saved. And then, even times too, I've sat with families doing the reset, they'll be like, oh, well, we'll do the forgot username, we'll do the forgot password. And often I made a note, especially about making separate logins, because they'll use an email address to recover their username that they made. And it's like, oh, well, I used my mom's email address, but it's tied to all of my student info. It's just her email because I wanted her to get all the info. But then mom might have, had a login as well and used an email that she didn't have access to anymore. And so all of these kinds of trip ups that happen. So you want to use an email address unique to you that you have access to always, that you're not going to lose. Like, for example, your high school email address you don't want to use. And you want it to be, yes, separate from your parent or family member, because as Dee Dee said, that student, that parent, you might have siblings in college, they're all going to have these logins that they'll need to maintain. And the reset, it has gotten smarter over the years too. Like you can have them text you a code and then you can use that secure code to reset your password and that kind of thing. So it's getting better and better, but it's just a best practice to know your info and keep it safe so that it's easy for you to do and it's not a hurdle.
And definitely do those, like it'll ask you, do you want to verify with an email address? Do you want to verify with your text? Definitely do those because it makes it a little bit easier if you end up having to reset your password. Because sometimes it's like, hey, you can reset your password, but you can't really use it for 30 more minutes. And so now you're stuck kind of sitting there and you're like,
at your appointment.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Or if you lock yourself out too many times and you can't get back in. And which is a good thing, it has your social security number and like your personal information. So you really want that to be protected. So it's not quite as easy as resetting like your Netflix passwords. You definitely want to make sure you're doing all of those important, like Lauren said, making sure it's a unique email address and that you verify it so you can easily reset it should you forget your password.
The most frustrating part about that is we know it can take anywhere from 20 to 30 minutes tops to do the FAFSA. But if you lock yourself out of your FSA ID account, I mean, you may be there 30, 40 minutes or 3 days waiting for a reset. So sometimes it can take longer to just get your credentials established than to actually complete the FAFSA. So this point is just really worth taking home. Save your login information in a safe place where you can get to it so you can make sure you get through the process quickly and smoothly and not have to sit there and wait till you can get back in your account. That's not fun.
And if your safe place is your mom and dad, that's great and that's awesome, but you need a safe place of your own too, because they have their own logins to keep in their safe place as well. So it's, you know, sometimes it's good to keep everything in one spot, but if you're away from home, if you're like, oh, it's a phone call or text away, it's a little bit tougher. So maybe they could be your backup, but you save it as well.
Plus students, I mean, this is daunting, but this is going to be your FSA ID for always, you know, when you do forever. So when you log
on your permanent record,
right? Because you're doing like your, if you decide to take out federal loans, it's how you log in to do your counseling. You know, once you graduate and you go into repayment, it's how you log into that site to do like certification and things like that. So this will be with you for quite some time. So make sure it's, again, something you can remember, tied to a unique email address that's accessible by you, and that you're going to be able to remember that. So,
right. All right. Well, moving on in the process kind of, so, you know, we talked about getting to the point of doing it. We talked about logging into it and making sure that we save that info. This is a pretty unique one, but it's something that comes up enough that we still wanted to include. Because we're talking about logins, because we're talking about FSA ID, a common thing that we will see is that students who have parents that might not be able to make an FSA ID login, they think that they can't complete the application. So they might not end up submitting because in this example, a parent doesn't have a social security number. So we just wanted to put this out there because it does come up quite a bit that a student needs to have a social security number to file a FAFSA. The student needs to make one of those FSA ID logins with the username and password, absolutely. And parents that have a social security number need to make an FSA ID login as well. It is time saving. It is a secure way to ensure that your FAFSA is complete and processed as quickly and accurately as possible. So we always encourage it. But a parent doesn't technically need to have a social security number to do the FAFSA. So if your parent doesn't have a social security number and you're worried about how to complete it, we're here to tell you what to do. Because you should still do the FAFSA and they should still provide their info on it if you're a dependent student. So if your parent does not have a social and they can't make an FSA ID, that's okay. Part of the application will ask for that info, and there's always that little question mark or help bubble to, you know, if you have a question about it, give you the answer. But we wanted to point out that if your parent doesn't have a social security number, you type all zeros in the field that asks for it, and that is the proper response that the government application requires. So you shouldn't use a different number if they have an alien registration number, for example, or individual taxpayer ID number for filing taxes without a social. The only thing you should put in there is a bunch of zeros, nine of them to be exact, but definitely don't leave it blank. You can complete this app, and it's certainly understandable, you know, that not every parent will have a social that's doing this FAFSA, even if the student has a social. And because the FSA ID is linked to signing the FAFSA as well, if you're putting all zeros in for the parent into that field that asks for it, it'll proceed with the application. But at the end, you'll have to actually complete a physical signature and mail that page to the Department of Ed. So we wanted to note that as well. It's a little extra step that you'll find when you're doing the application, but it'll guide you through those points, especially, you know, it'll know with all the zeros in that field that it needs to prompt for the signature page. It'll tell you the address right on the signature page of where to mail it to.
right.
So that is how students navigate that with families if an FSA ID cannot be made because you don't have a social.
Right. Don't mail it to your school, that signature page. Make sure you mail it to the address that's listed on that form. And again, one of the benefits of doing it early, because you've now completed your FAFSA, you have to print off that signature page, put it in the mail, have it sent to, I think it's an address in Kentucky
It's
still.
in Kentucky, yeah. I
It's in
didn't paste
Kentucky.
it in case they change anything about it. You know, sometimes it's unique to where you live, but anyway, yeah,
But
Kentucky.
yeah, mail it off, and then it has to get to that processing place, and they have to process it. So as you can already see, there's a couple of steps that go into that. And
Mhm.
again, if you're filing your FAFSA in June or July, you're not leaving yourself a lot of time. And that's definitely the thing that we want to make sure we've given you plenty of time to get all of that taken care of. And again, we know there are a lot of unique situations where parents may not have a social security number. Maybe they live in another country.
Mhm.
And so, again, like Lauren said, that's perfectly allowable. It's perfectly fine.
Mhm.
You're not going to get in any kind of trouble because of that. Like I said, make sure you're putting in all the zeros and then mailing off
Mhm.
that signature page.
Mhm. Right. It's really just to facilitate that knowledge of not everybody has one. We need a solution to make sure that those students still have FAFSAs getting filed and information still coming in. So yeah, definitely something we see quite a bit. And if anybody has any questions about like the privacy and security, our counselors can always talk to families about that. And again, this is how again, just to stress, it is totally okay, and we are happy to help any student or family worried about that kind of thing. And it's not something that'll stop you from doing the FAFSA. So I'm not, I'm hoping it's not out there. I haven't heard much, thankfully circulating around from like high schools or things like that where they think they can't, but we've gotten enough phone calls where we want to make sure people know you still do a FAFSA. But yeah, so that's something that has come up a bit and didn't want to leave it out here. Just trying to get us here. So Dee, if you want to talk about some of this nitpickiness as well, things that we see coming up with taxes and when this is all asking about.
Yeah. So one of the things about the FAFSA, and I always laugh because I say I know I sound like a crazy person. I'm like, what year is it? But it really is because we have to make sure we're tracking with the correct FAFSA year. It's based on your academic school year. So if you're thinking about, I'm doing the 2021, 2022 FAFSA for that academic year, it's going to ask for the taxes that you filed for 2019. And honestly, right now in October, it makes a little bit more sense because you're like, hey, the taxes you just filed a few months ago. And you're like, oh yeah, 2019. And you can probably have them still maybe on your desktop or in your desk and easily accessible. And so I think that's the biggest, one of the biggest things that we sometimes see when we
Mhm.
start getting to like into the next year. People are thinking, oh, I just filed my 2020 taxes. Should I use those? It's like, no, you have to go back and use your 2019. Or we get to, June or July and people are like, well, I can't find my 2019 taxes. So again, filing it early really still keeps that, you're more likely to have it. We probably all have that little folder that we have. I don't want to call it a junk folder, but we probably still all have that folder where we put a lot of that important stuff, W-2s, things like that. So you still have access to it. So I would definitely make sure you're looking at your correct tax years, make sure you're using the right information. Students, if you don't start working until the next year, that's fine. You don't have to report that information. Reporting the correct marital status. This is one, and we talked about it maybe last week or a few weeks ago in one of our other sessions. So definitely make sure you check those out. I know they are available on Facebook. We're going to try to move them to our YouTube channel as well. But just talking about who's your parent and who you should be putting on the FAFSA.
Mhm.
The best way of thinking about it is like you want to put your biological parent that you live with and that parent's spouse. So a lot of times, maybe your biological parents have separated, they're no longer together. And you're thinking, well, do I need to report both my mom and my dad? And you really want to put the parent you live with. And if that parent has remarried, their spouse. So being able to make sure you're doing that correctly, or even if your biological parents live together, but they are not married, making sure you're putting both of them on there.
Mhm.
So again, like I said, I know that you guys did a great job talking about that a few weeks ago. So, if you have any questions, definitely check that one out. But those are some of the common, because you're doing a great job of thinking about it, like I need to put my parents on here. But sometimes the FAFSA is asking questions a little bit differently. And it's important to really just answer the questions that FAFSA is asking. Because sometimes we can be a little bit more logical as people than a form can be. So that's often something that can really throw people off in terms of thinking, this is how I should answer it. And it's like, no, they really are asking for this very different thing. So.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I like to think of this whole concept of is we're in a time warp because we're warping through time. So as Dee Dee said, you're filling out an application for next year for the 2021-2022 academic year. But they're asking you to put your tax and income information from last year.
Mm-hmm.
But then some of the questions, such as what's the marital status of you and your parents? Who's in your household? What are your assets? That's as of right now. So you're dealing with 3 different time periods. And it's really important to keep that in mind. So those questions about who are you, where do you live, who's in your household, who's your mama, who's your daddy, those questions are for as of right now, currently, as of right now, where you're putting those numbers into the FAFSA. Tax information is from last year or the past year or the 2 years past. So it can be a little confusing. And as Lauren said, please don't hesitate to ask questions if you get turned around. We know that, it is streamlined to make things easier, but just grasping the timeline of things sometimes can get a bit confusing. So make sure that you're being careful about that, that you're asking questions, you're being asked to answer questions about what's going on with me right now. What am I going to do?
Right.
Because there's questions about what year you're going to be in school. You're going to be a freshman, a sophomore, whatever. But that's not for right now. That's for next year.
Right. So, you have a sibling who's going to be in school next year. You kind of have to start thinking about that.
Yes.
We sometimes get like, oh, I think my brother, my sister, they're going to college as well. And that's really important. Make sure you include that. The number in college matters. So Deborah, that's a good point. It is a time warp.
Definitely.
The vortex.
Right.
And it's hard, like you feel like you want to get like ahead of, like how Dee Dee mentioned, like you want to get ahead of a question. So you're already like putting your mindset in a certain place. And sometimes, again, remembering what we're talking about now is helpful. Be like, oh yeah, I remember old tax year, current household marital status, but future, future school year coming up, that kind of thing. But just knowing that reading the question, it will say the time frame too. So reading the questions carefully can help that as well. Like they're not trick questions. It does jump around a lot, which is not fun in the time warp, but it's not like doing like the time warp dance, But at the same time, oh man, I just say that. Okay, anyway, so at the same time,
well, you won't come back as a baby, so that's a good point.
It's helpful. But yeah, like, it's just that if you're second guessing yourself or being like, wait, when did this or that happen? Or I live with my mom more, but she's remarried, that's her spouse, so I'm going to report her marital status. But when they ask you for the 2019 tax info, it'd be like, were they married then? It's like, different question, answer about these people. The questions will guide you on who to include and when they're asking about. So yeah, it's straightforward if you read the question, but you do a lot of bouncing around. That is for sure.
Straightforward, but it curves.
Right. It's like, get all ready to answer about this. And now let's switch gears. So you just got to be ready for it. But Dee Dee, you were totally right too. Like keeping an early filing makes it more logical. Like, okay, yeah, 2019, I just did that. Let me get that on file, or like you said, I'm thinking, I could have filed in October, but now it's January, February. What taxes does it need? Like, still 2019 for this upcoming. So, good points. So, what errors do we have in store next? So, yeah, I just wanted to make sure we have spoken about this in prior sessions, and those are accessible. Definitely recommend you revisit them as you need. But just to continue that conversation, we included as a separate error, who do I include in the household? So again, not only asking about when did all of this stuff happen, in regards to parents or getting remarried or things like that. But oftentimes we see people count the members of the household wrong, or count people in the household that if they get flagged for extra review later, like verification paperwork, we'll see differences between their answer. I've seen FAFSAs come in with 10 people in the household and about 3 or 4 in college, and then I get their worksheet in where they've written out who's in the household just with a little extra instruction, and they're a family of 4 and they're the only one going to school next year. So I'm like, I don't know who you thought these 10 people were. But it's things that we just see that I find this one to be, it can be confusing, because maybe that 10 people is, well, I live with my mom and my stepdad and my sibling, but then my dad has a family too, and he has I have a stepmom on that side, and they might count everybody, but FAFSA, it has those specific roles. So we definitely wanted to break down who to include in a baseline. And there are always, again, scenarios where they're unique to your family and your situation. But in most cases, if you're a dependent student or a student who has to use parent info on the FAFSA, just to make sure you're including the right people, you should include yourself. So don't forget you. You count in the household. You count as somebody in college for the year that you're applying for, obviously, because you're going to be applying for financial aid. So yourself, I say parent or parents, because again, if your biological parents are married and live together, that's 2 more people. That's your parents in the house. If they're unmarried and they live together, that still means that both of your biological parents count in your household. If you live with one parent more than the other and they're separated, that's your parent in the household. If that parent's remarried, your step parents in the household. So again, thinking of who's who, we talk about it a lot, but it's because it also affects this number. Siblings who live in your household with that parent or parents, as we talked about, who's my parent on the FAFSA. So siblings who live in the house, FAFSA has a separate designation also. They're supposed to be living in the house, and they receive more than 50% of their financial support from a parent in the sibling, example, or your parents' other children. So it gets a little nitpicky, but generally it's who else lives with you. So if your 10-year-old brother lives with your mom and your stepdad and you, that person would be in the household. And other dependents, it's less common, but if, say, for example, a grandparent does live in your house with your family, it gets a little tricky. They might be receiving federal benefits that cover more of their financial support. But if they live in the house, if your parent also covers more than 50% of their financial support, other dependents might be in your household too. So that's, just a quick rundown of, after you do establish who is my parent that I use in the FAFSA, who counts in my household. Another aspect of this too that I didn't put on the slide, but it's obviously a very big part, is how many of your family in your household are in college. We see a lot of parents who put themselves in college if they're also enrolled of a dependent student, but that parent can also be filing a separate FAFSA for themselves because they're a student too. So if your parent's in college and you're doing the FAFSA, don't count the parent in college. They can do their own FAFSA and count themselves in college there. Not to get too hairy on that one, but who's in the household and who's in college does come up, in those cases.
Hey, Lauren,
Yeah.
Jay just gave us a question that popped up in the comments. So since we're talking about the household size and who should be counted, let's see if we can maybe help her out in this. It says, how do you count people in a household? And also, FAFSA asks for both parents and who's the oldest. So maybe just, take a little bit more time and just kind of go back through that and just kind of maybe walk through that one more time on how to count who's in the household and how FAFSA looks at who should be counted, because and going to the illustration that you used about maybe having a grandparent or another relative, and maybe talk a little bit about how support works in that situation, whether or not they would be counted.
Okay. All right. So maybe I'll use an example to help highlight this question. So who do I count in the household? Let's give an example where your parents are divorced and you live with your mom, and mom is not remarried. Mom's not married to anybody in this example at the moment, as of the day you're filing FAFSA. So if you're counting who's in the household and you've got, again, or divorced parents, you lived with your mom. Let's say you have a sibling, you know, who is 18, they're going to NC State next year. So
Wait, they're coming to UNCG. Okay.
you're going to UNCG. Your sibling has to live a separate life and be their own person.
Okay.
I didn't say you're twins, but
Okay, sorry. I digress. Go ahead.
Anyway, but yeah, so say in that example, the student counts himself in the household. In this example, their mom is divorced, they live with mom, and mom's not remarried. Mom counts in the household. In this case, it does turn out to be a physical household. It's not always the case, I guess, if you think about, you know, like, well, I'm going to college and I'm going to live at college next year, but I'm using my parent information on the FAFSA because I'm a dependent. So again, thinking about it less strict, you know, especially if it's who is separated or remarried and that kind of thing, you know, so it's not always like a physical household if you're going to be living away at school, but yourself, if you live with mom more in the past year and mom is divorced and not remarried, your mom is in the household. Your sibling who's also college age counts in the household, even if they're going to a different school next year. So that's a family of 3 in that example. And who's in college next year would be you and your sibling, whether you go to UNCG, both of you, or you go to 2 different schools. So let's say this student says, oh, but my grandma moved in too, and I want to see, do they count in the household? And I guess I should go back to, sorry not to jump around too much, but the FAFSA doesn't ask which of your parents is the oldest to include. So I'm not sure where that question came up, but
Actually, there is a question that says the age of the oldest parent. Or there used to be. Yeah.
okay.
Age of the oldest parent, but that would be the oldest parent that is in your household. So
Interesting.
Right.
Okay.
So if it's only mom, then mom is the oldest parent.
Does it still ask that now? Sorry.
I'll have to look back at they did make some changes. I'll have to look back to see
Okay.
if they did make that particular change, but it was definitely a question. It has been a question,
Okay.
you know, historically.
Welcome to our conversation about
A lot of history. You know, one of the things on the FAFSA it does ask for, and it's important to keep track of, is parent 1 and parent 2. If you have
Right.
parents that you're using on the FAFSA, because that will play a role when you go to sign it. So you want to make sure parent 1 is, you know, if you've used mom as parent 1, when you sign it, you're saying who you're signing it. So maybe that's the question they're getting into.
Oh, yeah.
Pull up the FAFSA PDF and check on that particular question.
Thank you. But yeah, so that's a good point too, though. Like, so I guess, you know, just to wrap up this example. So again, we have you, your mom, your sibling, and mom's not remarried in this example. Grandparent, if they're in the house, it's like, okay, do I count them? Are they a dependent is the real question. So if the grandparent lives in the house, that's one thing. But in this example, somebody who's not a sibling of yours or not another child of your parent, to see if they're a dependent who counts on the FAFSA, that grandparent would have to receive more financial support from your family than some other source. So say grandparent is still working, but they live in your house. If they have an income coming, you might not financially support them more than their job. So just because they're a grandparent doesn't mean it's an automatic, oh, that's another dependent I have, just because they live with you, for example. Also, a grandparent who's retired might be receiving Social Security benefits, and that amount of financial support could outweigh what family support the grandparent receives. So always reach out to us if you have a question about that. We can document it at the school level if we need, you know, to show why a grandparent counts in the household. It's less common because a lot of folks are retired and they do receive those types of benefits, and that medical care and those kinds of things that are not, being financially provided by the family at that point. But yeah, and see in this example too, just as Dee Dee said, the FAFSA will ask parent one, parent two. But in this example where I'm thinking, well, my household is me, my sibling, and my mom who's divorced and not remarried, we know you have a second parent, but we're thinking about the FAFSA household, you would only have a parent one on the FAFSA in that example. And parent one would sign the FAFSA and complete it. In an example where your parents are married or your parent on the FAFSA is remarried and you're using your step parent as well, Dee Dee's absolutely right. Keeping track of parent one, parent two throughout the application can be super important, making sure that identifies who's signing it with you at the end. And, you know, again, if your parent is married, you include their spouse in that household. Since mom is divorced in this example we were using and dad might be, you know, separate, he doesn't live in the house, you don't include him in your household. Even though you know your family, it's talking about this different structure, this FAFSA household.
Right. You know, Lauren, one of the examples I usually use for students to help them think about it, especially, you know, as you get a little bit older, as a student, maybe you have an apartment and you're living off campus. But again, if you're based on those dependency questions, if you're using a parent, you always want to think about that parent's household and who's in it and then adding yourself. So it's not so much about who claims who on taxes, because we know there can be a lot of different situations where maybe maybe you actually are living in an apartment with your sibling, and so they actually claim you. Now you're not putting your sibling on the FAFSA as your parent. You're still going to put your, parent, your parent one or parent two, you're going to put that parent on the FAFSA, and then it's their household. So I always think about it. I always tell students to think about, sure, you live in an apartment, you live here, you're using parent information, but you want to think about their household. So mom, dad, who are they married to? Who are the kids in that household? Especially if there are situations where there are step siblings. And we know family can, look a lot of different ways nowadays. And so maybe you've got a step sibling who lives there part of the time, they live somewhere else. And that can get a little dicey in terms like, well, we know that you can't necessarily divide it even. So I always tell students, use things like, where's your favorite stuffed animal? Where do you keep that? Where's your home base?
Yeah.
Maybe, think about that. It's like, well, I live with my dad, during this time of the year. I live with my mom this time. Like, where's like your most favorite stuff? Maybe that's the way of thinking about it. Be like, okay, consider that your home base when you're split between two parents. Whose parent are you on with insurance? Maybe, so thinking about some of these other ways where we know, as much as we want to keep things 50-50, sometimes they're a little bit on a different side. So using those as markers to say, and again, not necessarily who claims who, because we know that families can switch off on that sometimes. But thinking about that way, so those other little points where it's like, well, this is my home base is one of the ways that, students have often expressed it. And then using that family in that situation. And then just remembering it and keeping it the same, because like I said, just because brother may claim you 1 year because you're living in his home because it's closer to campus, dad, mom, they may switch off, things like that. So usually that's one of the ways I always explain to students, like, what's that home? And then you add yourself into it. And the FAFSA does break this down. Again, I was looking at it today, where it says like your household, and it automatically gives you a little one for yourself, and you can't make that change. It'll ask, do you have any dependents that you support? It'll let you put in like, a number 0. It'll ask, pulling in that parent information. So it kind of helps you try to think through and to calculate who's in the household, the number. So just really making sure you're plugging in those points. Like, hey, I've got 2 siblings. I've got 1 sibling in college. And then at the end, it'll say your household size is 5. So it tries to be helpful in that sense. So again, just plugging those numbers in can really keep you on track and avoid some of these kind of very confusing mistakes that are easy to trip you up on.
Right. And
that's really good, Dee Dee.
I haven't heard you use that analogy. That's so smart.
That is a really good analogy. One of the things too, especially going back to the idea of maybe who's providing the insurance coverage, because typically the idea of support is, mostly financial support and who's providing more of the resources. So yeah, that's a really good way of looking at that. If you do feel like you're living with the, one parent, with both parents 50-50, well then who's paying for, whose insurance you're on, that could definitely swing the balance to, who's providing the 51% of the support. So definitely could. Jade's given us a time check here. So I think we got really involved in that.
We did. Well, and it's, these are the questions we get. I don't want to forget our independent students on this slide though. So I'll recap that really quick. But I do feel like we still do get errors with household size from independent students, but it's less common. Like if you're a student, you count yourself, if you're married or not, like, personally what's going on in your life. So if you are married, you include your spouse. And so also, again, if you're an independent student and you have children and they live with you, you count them and dependents on you too. And as Dee Dee said, it will guide you through and build that household as you answer the questions. But I do feel like it's just a little bit more straightforward when you're answering about yourself and you're not considering your parent situation, your parent marital situation, any step siblings, switching houses. So independent students get it a little bit easier. But remembering that tax claim thing is
one of the things about an independent student, because remember for FAFSA, and I was telling someone earlier today, it's like, I don't want to sound like cold or cruel, like you got to pick a parent who supports you the most,
Yeah.
because we know your parents support you in different ways, and we're not putting a value on that. Unfortunately, the FAFSA does, so you kind of have to make a choice and pick one of those parents. Mm-hmm. They're also very much like, based on that, if you were born before January 1, 19, whichever, it's going to determine that you're dependent or independent. So you very well could be a dependent student who has an apartment, you're working, you kind of pay for that apartment, but you're 22 years old. So FAFSA is going to say you need parent information. And yeah, you got to put your parent information on there. And you could be a 25 or 26-year-old student who is still living at home because you're going back to school. FAFSA is going to say you're an independent and you don't need to include your parents on there. So it can be a little bit, again, like we talked about earlier, not the way we think about it, but it has a very particular way they're going to think about it. So I would say for, making sure for an independent student, if you're independent because of that question, your household really becomes you, your spouse, not necessarily your boyfriend.
And your dog.
Or your dogs.
Do not put your dog on the FAFSA.
I'll let Dee Dee finish her point, and I'm going to put my mute on.
But just saying that, even if you, really only if you're married, you may be living with someone and you may have been together for years, but if you're not married, you don't necessarily have to count that person on your FAFSA. So again, for independent students, maybe if you have a child, this is something that we sometimes see, you may have a child, but again, here's an example. If you're 22 and you're like, hey, I've got a kid, but my mom and my dad, they're going to help me take care of my kids. I'm going to live at home. Technically, you're still considered a dependent student. Now, if you're 22 and you live in an apartment and you're supporting you and your child on your own, you're considered independent because you have a dependent. So definitely, this is one of those things where, give us a call. We are here to help you answer that kind of question because it can be different than how we think about it, because again, family looks different. And sometimes the FAFSA just hasn't caught up with that yet.
Right. Thank you. Jay just made a good point to not include fur babies in your household. They are in your family, but they're not in your FAFSA household.
More demanding.
They're clearly a huge part of our lives, as we know. But yes, as Jade gave us a time check, I just want to make sure that we do hit on some of these remaining points. So I want to skip ahead if that's okay. Just to one of the FAFSA errors that we've talked about too in previous sessions, not checking the student aid report. So this is, again, we've kind of walked through the beginning of the FAFSA, filing phase, having your login set, making sure we guided, you through some of those household questions and who you're answering about and what time frame. But the student aid report is really important as it's a result in a way of completing the FAFSA, just like we talked about those confirmation emails that you receive. But it's also just another sign that your application's being processed and it's following those steps, that you're keeping aware of that process, like before the school is going to contact you about your aid eligibility, if the school needs something else, and then eventually the school notifying you of your aid offer. So the student aid report, this is just a screenshot of the first page of an example. It can be up to 10 pages. Again, it's just a spit out summary essentially of what you've completed on your application, but there's other key information on it. So this thing that we've talked about in the past, verification, the student aid report will tell you, it's here in this top middle section, that second checkbox, your FAFSA has been selected for verification. So it'll tell you as soon as it knows,
Right.
hey, heads up, keep your tax forms and your paperwork ready. The school is going to reach out to you and ask you to confirm some of the information that you've provided. It will say it on the student aid report as soon as your FAFSA is processed, as soon as it knows that the government has flagged your application for that review. And we've talked about this in prior sessions. It's just turning in information to confirm that the answers on the FAFSA are correct. So you're not in trouble. It's a really common thing. But knowing you have the opportunity on the student aid report to see if that's something to anticipate is super important to not miss, because you don't want to get these emails from the school and not, I guess, be ready to answer some of those questions or to provide some of that paperwork. It just gives you a leg up on knowing, hey, I've got this coming up. So the school will let you know. Also, I made a little dot where you can see that it tells you the EFC. So expected family contribution is a calculation that the FAFSA creates. It is not the bill amount that you receive, but it's a good estimate on what affordability factor your family might have when it comes to paying for college. So it guides a lot of the federal aid eligibility. You'll see your future financial aid info from the school refer to that number a lot. So it's on the student aid report. It's good to know as you get more information from the school to describe that and explain your situation, you'll at least have that information kind of defined for you in the beginning. But you'll get a lot more follow-up on it from your school. And then also corrections. So the other pages on the student aid report will let you know if you missed a question that you have to go back and complete. So it might let you finish the app, but it wants you to make sure you didn't make a mistake. So when it's smart enough to catch a mistake or an error, student aid report is going to tell you what to go back on your FAFSA and correct. So as we're talking about errors, I didn't want to leave it out again and just stress how it's structured to help remind you of doing your FAFSA the most complete, correct way. But yeah, it can be up to a 10-page document. So a lot of it's just recapping what you've already answered on the FAFSA too. And for security purposes, it will mask your information. I think we've talked about too in the past. So along with early filing, as we've talked about multiple times, not asking for help is a huge error, and we don't want that for you. So please contact us if you need help any point in the process, before you filed, during, or if you're wondering what comes next. We made that commitment to doing this, session on Facebook. It'll be available for you later, but the core of it, we'll have our contact info at the end, is that we want to help students finish this application. We want you to get all the aid you're eligible for, and you can list up to 10 schools on the FAFSA. So we know you want to end up at UNCG, but we also know that you might have this going to other schools, and other schools' aid offices should be on the page that we are. We hope they are, wanting students to reach out if you need help, to make sure that you're not stopping your application from being early and going through fixing errors as soon as possible, and getting that info back from all the schools that you apply to as soon as you can to make your decisions about where you're going. So we put our school code up there too, 002976. It's going to be a part of the FAFSA. It'll ask you where to send it. If you want to confirm that you've chosen the right UNC school, University of North Carolina, Greensboro, the number, you can jot it down.
And definitely, this year, being able to help students looks a little bit different. In the past, we have been able to have evenings where students could come on to campus, you bring your parents, we could sit down with you and do it. And unfortunately, right now, it looks a little bit different, but we are still here to help. I had a student today call me on the phone, and we sat, and he had his FAFSA up, and we were able to kind of go through it and work on it that way. So, yes, you may not be able to come in and sit down and have us do it, but you can give us a call. The most important thing is to make sure you have everything ready. So know your questions, even as you are, starting the FAFSA. If you've kind of run into a spot, you're like, I don't really know how to answer this. Still take a look around at the type of questions it's asking for, because that way, when you call us, you know exactly what the question is. And so we're able to help you. It's a little bit faster. We can really pinpoint what's going on. There is a PDF version available. Quick Google search will pop that up for you. It's on studentaid.gov. Deborah, do we have a link on our website to the FAFSA PDF?
We probably don't have a link to the exact PDF, but if you go to studentaid.gov, they do have that.
Okay.
I think they may have a link on the front page, or especially after you get into the aid process. So they have some menu bars at the top of the page that are more general information. And so some of those resources will be able to link you to the PDF copy of that. So as Dee Dee said, we typically would have been doing these FAFSA workshops in person, but we do want to encourage you to reach out to us. You see our contact information on the screen. So you can reach us by phone from Monday through Friday, 9 to 4. We do appointments, but you will need to call if you're not a current student so that we can get that set up for you. You can do a virtual appointment via Zoom, or you can do a face-to-face. And if you do have just general questions, send us an email. And Lauren, if you can go to the next slide, we can let them look at Minnie. So they can see Minnie, who's our chat bot, and she is available 24/7, 365 days out of the year, unless it's a leap year, then it's 366. But yeah, Minnie can answer most of your general questions. And if there is a question that Minnie does not have an answer for you, you will have an opportunity to be forwarded to our email, or maybe another office if it's a question about admissions. And next week, we're going to be back here for our last session. So you can just flip all the way over to that last slide. We're going to talk about what's next after you file the FAFSA. So we definitely want you to be here. It's going to be again at 6 o'clock, and we want you to be here. So we're just happy that you joined us tonight. Lauren, you can stop, because I do have one last thing that we want to do before we go, as we thank everybody for being here with us. I also want to thank you, Lauren, for your help all these weeks and being here on the live presentation. And this is our last session together. I know I'm getting a little teary-eyed because I've been so used to having you here. And Lauren's going to be taking on a new role in a new location. So this is her last session with us, her last work day with us is next week. So we're really going to miss you. And we just want to tell you how much we appreciate you putting all of these slides together. She's done a phenomenal job of putting these slides together these past couple of weeks. And I really appreciate your help. Appreciate your contribution to things. I know Chris is going to be just beside him. So that's probably why he's not here tonight. He's probably at home crying. But and I want to thank Dee for stepping in tonight. And she's a phenomenal counselor. I know those of you who've spoken to her on the phone probably know that. So this is the DD. This is DD. And we just wanted to make sure that you know that. But yeah, we just want to give you a round of applause, Lauren, for being here. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And we're definitely going to miss you. And,
thank you.
Yeah. So any parting words, either of you, any last words as we leave our audience?
I want to be nice to Dee Dee and you too. Deborah really has organized the majority of all of this. So Deborah Slade, as always, is too humble, but thank you so much for your guidance and for making sure that all of this runs smoothly. And Dee Dee, you too, for caring so much about our students and for participating in doing this. I appreciate you guys so much.
Yeah. Dee Dee?
Yeah, so thanks, Lauren. The reason I use my tacos and cookies analogy because that's my friend for Lauren. It's what we do together. So it's going to be a little bit harder to get those in the future, but we'll still do it together.
Yeah. Well, and we also want to thank
FAFSA.
Yeah, that's the parting all the time. Is file the FAFSA.
Parting gift to you, to everyone. File your FAFSA.
And kudos and thanks 100% to Jade Andrews behind the scenes, who's keeping us on point. And Makisha, who's one of our newest counselors, is also tuning in, and she's gathering information and giving us encouragement in the chat. So we're really appreciative of everybody joining us. This video will be up on our Facebook page for you to review later. If you want PDF copies of the slides, to send us an email to fin8@uncg.edu. And we'll see you all back here again next week. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.